This is Comic Shenanigans, episode 1138, a conversation with Chaz Gower.
Ain't no stopping them shenanigans. Love getting into shenanigans. All up in them shenanigans. 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 Shenanigans.
Welcome to the Comic Shenanigans podcast. I'm your host, Adam Chapman. This is episode 1138. It's a conversation with Chaz Gower. Chaz was previously on the show back in episode 1075 in January of 2025 to talk about his previous book, which was Stanley Lied. So he's back this time to talk about another book. There are some issues with the audio in this episode, so I do apologize. There was some feedback sometimes when I would talk on Chaz's end, so I do apologize. At times it'll be a little rough to listen to. Tried to smooth that out a little bit. He's talking about his new book that just came out called Ditko and Romita versus Lee: The Origins of Spider-Man. This is again a relatively new release, just in the last month or so. So this was interesting. I kind of mentioned in the show, I do appreciate the way that Chaz kind of goes through the timeline of Amazing Spider-Man and Doctor Strange being published in the 60s, what it says about the creators, what we can see about a lot of the evidence at the time, but just how much Stan Lee actually wrote, if anything, and how most of it was obviously being generated by the main creators. In this case, Steve Ditko, although there's a lot of mention of Jack Kirby as well. So just kind of take that into account. And I like the doing a book like this, which is around, material that people have obviously covered a lot more in the last 10, 20 years. I like the chronological aspect. It reminded me somewhat, I know that Chaz isn't a huge fan, of Nuff Said, which was by Tomorrow's Publishing, which is the same type of idea of trying to kind of lay out the words of Stan Lee and Jack Kirby in that case, chronologically, from a lot of primary sources as to what was kind of really going on during the 60s. So, this was a great conversation with Chaz. We'll have him back when he has a new book to talk about, which we do mention at the end of this episode, that is something that he's working on. So this was great. Again, the book just came out on March 2nd, so it's a relatively new release. We would have chatted about it earlier, but you know what? I just kept having to reschedule. That's on me this time. Thank you for joining. Thank you for downloading this episode. If you're new to Comic Shenanigans, we have an extensive back catalog of episodes where we talk with other creators. So please give that a shout. Check that out, I should say. You can email us at comicshenanigans@gmail.com, rate the show on Apple Podcasts, listen to us on Apple Podcasts, and also listen to us on Spotify. I promise I sound better in the episode. It's before I started losing my voice, so I sound a lot better, even if the audio is at times a little scratchy at that time because of the feedback that we were having at that point. But thanks for listening, and let's jump right into the episode with Chaz Gower. Enjoy. Chaz, welcome back to the Comic Shenanigans podcast. How are you today?
Thank you. I'm great today. Thank you for having me back.
So it's interesting. When I last had you on the show, it was I think around Christmas Day here, Christmas Eve, 2024. So it's been a year and a bit. Now we have a new book of yours to talk about. It's interesting. At the time, you were like, "Well, I might do something comic related. I'm not sure." So I guess the question is, when was the genesis for this new book, which is called Ditko and Romita versus Lee: The Origins of Spider-Man?
I did a Thailand travel guide in between, which I knocked out pretty quickly. And I think in a couple of, on one of the forums, it was the CGC forum, I believe, I started to have kind of some arguments about what Romita had said, John Romita, in terms of his working relationship with Lee. And I started to realize Romita actually told us a lot of stuff, and it's kind of been glossed over through the years. I mean, Romita really kind of gave it up and said, I do the writing. He didn't say Stan didn't do anything. Mm-hmm. I mean, he would, but it was kind of one of those things where if you read enough of it, you realize exactly what he's saying. And once that happened, I thought, can put this together with what Ditko said, and it pretty much matches up to tell us how it worked. And it just wrote itself, basically, through that.
It's interesting because I know what you're talking about. Like, if I remember on like the Daredevil movie, and they had the special features and that kind of stuff, and they had stuff with John Romita, and the idea was I guess it's because he was always so jokey and always so kind of making light of the situation, and had that kind of twinkle in his eye, and everyone kind of liked listening to John Romita Sr., that when he jokes about, next month Kingpin and that's all he has to go on, I think we all just kind of like, oh, that's just a fun story. I don't think, and as in your book, you're kind of like, well, he's telling us that Stan's not giving him anything. But we all kind of handwove it for many years. I don't know why we did that. I think it was just maybe the affable nature with which John was kind of talking. But there's something really, serious going on there that you're right, we just kind of glossed over.
And when you read it all, when you read so much more of it, I mean, realistically, and the best quote I got right as I was finishing the book on the Marvel Method Facebook group, somebody had posted it, and I had never found this. I guess in an early, Gary Groth, who went on, of course, to do the Comics Journal, which naturally was one of my favorite things, throughout the 90s that I read. He originally, his Fantastic Fanzine special #1 from 1970, they had like a John Romita interview in there. And this is Romita's quote. I draw fairly fast, but plotting stories from scratch takes me longer than most. I put a lot of thought into continuity and character development, and we feel it's worth it. My God, I mean, there could be no more damning of a statement than that from him. You know what I mean? And that's been essentially overlooked for 50 years. That's incredible what he said there. And when you take not just that, but everything, I mean, basically, here's what it worked with Romita. Stan was busy running around doing his, college things and, living his, lifestyle of him and his wife running around. And so I think he didn't really, and this is conjecture, but he didn't take comics as seriously as people like to believe he did. And you can tell this because Spider-Man was his favorite character. It's the one he loved the most, that he thought would make him the most famous and make him the most money eventually. But he loved it, which. So the way he handled it tells us exactly who Stan is as far as how he did the comics. And what I get from reading all the John Romita quotes and interviews on this is that Romita would try to pin him down. What are we doing this month? And Stan would try to have conversations with him, but everything would be going on. They would always get interrupted. He would always have other things for Romita to do. And so a lot of times he would get things like Stan would say, why don't we bring Doc Ock back? And he wants to steal a missile system. And Romita would try to talk more to him about it, but something would split it up, and he would be on his own to finish it, which is fine because, I have to say at the beginning of both books, I make the point of saying, I'm not saying Stan Lee did nothing, which is one of the things that his, followers try to always pin me down on. You're saying Stan did not? No, I'm not saying Stan did nothing. I'm saying he didn't do what he said he did. Yeah, he came up with ideas here and there. They were generic, regurgitated ideas, but he wasn't writing the book. He wasn't writing the stories. He was allowed. He made the artists do that, and they are the ones who wrote the stories. And then he came in afterwards, and sometimes I'm sure made minor changes, but ultimately he wasn't writing those stories. The artists were, even Romita. So, yeah, Romita tells us.
When you start kind of putting the book together, again, you did the first book, which was all about the origins of Marvel Comics, and obviously the structure of that one was to directly refute claims of Stan and use supporting evidence, but that was your framework. When did you kind of decide that the framework of this would be to kind of go issue by issue and see the development of the misappropriation?
When you do the issue by issue, well, a lot of times Ditko started off, man, it would have been great if Ditko would have finished his essays issue by issue. I mean, he could have told us so much, and but he started off that way, and it told us a lot. His relationship with Lee changed in the way they did it. At first, they would get together and they would discuss things. He wasn't always specific about what they would discuss or how it would work. Later on, through other artists, they would tell us, I would go in to see Lee, and he wouldn't have any ideas, or he would say to me, what have you got? You know, Ditko didn't go that heavy. In fact, sometimes he would tell us, he would say, I would bring this character with these mechanical arms to Stan and say, what do you think about this? And Stan would say, well, call him Dr. Octopus. So once again, you know, Ditko gives him credit for what he would say or did say. He gives him credit for saying, we can't kill Betty Brant. You know, the fans don't like him as a love interest, but if we kill him, that puts kind of a dark specter over the book. You know, it's already started off on that. And he says Lee was right, you know. So I think because he went issue by issue when he started doing it, I thought there's enough here to do it that way. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of a fun way to examine it. But also, and this is a huge thing for exposing Lee in terms of not writing the stories. If you take like any point like along that timeline, and I'll pick it out here and say, you read Amazing Spider-Man 33 and 34, which we know Ditko was doing on his own. Lee told us that, Ditko told us that, Roy Thomas told us that. And then you take Daredevil 12 and 13, which Lee was doing with Romita at the time, mm-hmm. and you take Fantastic Four 47 and 48, and you read those 6 books back to back. There's no logical thinking person that can say one person wrote all 3 of those books. Mm-hmm. They are completely different in tone, style. Those Daredevil issues are almost comical with how bad they are. That was Lee teaching Romita how to do a comic book, and they're horribly bad. Romita's run on Daredevil's terrible. Daredevil in general, and I say it in the book, is probably the worst written Marvel Silver Age comic book. It never was really anything until a real creator came in, Frank Miller. I mean, he had the Wood issues, and Bill Everett's issue was phenomenal, the first issue. Mm-hmm. That was a great issue. And that's why I always say that's another thing. You read Daredevil 1 and then you read Daredevil 2 with Joe Orlando. Mm-hmm. If you can't tell that's not the same writer, you're not paying attention. It's unbelievable how it changes. And but there were some things there. Wood tried to do some stuff and made some changes. But once Wood was gone, that book for the rest of its run up until Miller came along was, I mean, really, and the numbers reflected it went down in sales every year for a decade, you know. It was doing, I think, when Miller came there, it was doing 111,000 average copies a month. It was really low. It was really bad. Mm-hmm. So that was the other thing with doing it issue by issue, month by month, is you could compare it to other things going on and watch how it came together. It tells the story itself again.
When you're doing the research, and because obviously you have so many articles that you're quoting, so many interviews that, you know, the various men have done, you're also quoting letters, pages, etc. Like when you're kind of compiling your outline of how you're going to kind of use these quotes, because it's interesting, some of the quotes you use the germ of it and then you kind of expand it later to show the rest of the quote as it becomes more relevant as you go through time. So what was that kind of process like to kind of collect that data? Like, do you have giant whiteboards that you're kind of, you know, these are the quotes I want to use for this particular moment? Like, how do you kind of structure that in and around your chronological setting of each issue as it comes out? Obviously, some of it is very specific and easier because it refers to specific titles. But otherwise, like, how do you kind of collate that data for yourself?
Well, it's not always easy, but when it comes together, it's extremely satisfying. But keeping track of it, and a lot of those guys on the Marvel method were very, very helpful, because there were times when I was doing something, I was like, oh, I need that quote from this thing. Where was it? I'll go to look for it. For some reason, I'm really bad at searching for things. When I when I need it specifically. And so sometimes I would go in there and I'd be like, hey, what's this one quote from here, blah, blah, blah. Does anybody know where that's from? And they would send me a message and find it just like that. Thankfully, those guys were extremely helpful when it comes to it. And just bouncing ideas off those guys because there's such a history of information there, you know. It really is like the uber nerd core of understanding the Marvel method and how, well, it was full of crap in terms of why it was put together. It was put together so Lee could basically, you know, take the credit and the pay away from those artists. It was the most extreme form in a industry full of penance, you know. It happened at the other, well, we know it happened at DC. I don't know if it happened everywhere, but at DC it happened where they would come in and Romita talked about it, fill out these things for gift certificates to give the editor or whatever at Christmas time. There was always those things that happened, but Lee took it to the most extreme with this Marvel method thing. So, but yeah, keeping those quotes together it could be challenging at times, definitely.
It's interesting when we try to understand the history of these men and the industry, that obviously there's so much of the mentality that we can't understand because we haven't grown up in a depression, or like we didn't have family members in the depression, because obviously that informs so much of how these men acted in different ways. When I was speaking specifically about not just Romita and Ditko, but also Kirby, and so their influences and what they kind of bring into it. So when you see Romita kind of being the company man, he's a guy who wants to keep his job. He's a guy who's doing what he has to do to put food on the table and doesn't lead an ostentatious lifestyle. It is hard to have that run counter to what we think of people now because we don't necessarily think of that way. We're not used to thinking in a depression mindset. Has that been challenging when writing books like this? Because we have to understand the mentality. And also, you couldn't have three more different guys between Ditko, Kirby, and Lee. Like, the mentalities of those three people could not be more different.
Right, absolutely. And, you know, there's a little bit of that I take into account, but I think it is important, certainly in the discussion of it, because people don't know, they don't understand. I think Ditko is probably the least understood of all of them. Romita's like an everyday guy. You know, he just wants to get up every day, go to work, and wants his job to be, you know, easy. This is what I got to do today. And, but he's also manipulated by the corporation. He's, you know, Romita said I say this at the beginning of the book. I grew up, Romita was my favorite artist. I mean, he was one of my favorite artists. So it pains me to hear the things that he said about Ditko throughout his life, which obviously were influenced by Marvel to see it as and say it as. Romita obviously wasn't interested in the truth of things in regards to how it would affect his job, as many people do. Many people go to work and they hate their job, but they know if they go to work every day and they say, I hate my job, that's not going to reflect well on them. That's not going to benefit them long term as far as the job and stuff. Romita really got ripped off as badly as any of them did. He just wasn't as great of a creator as Ditko and Kirby were by any stretch of the imagination, but he still got robbed, you know. But he was okay with it because he looked at it, I guess, as I had a job my entire life that paid me decently. And I think Lee probably paid him a little bit better, you know, at a certain point because he handled everything. I mean, really, he was the creative force behind the second half of the Silver Age. You know, when you take out what Kirby did, because Kirby brought everything together. It was Fantastic Four, Thor, for a little while Captain America, for a little while Nick Fury. And other than that, he wasn't doing layouts. He wasn't giving away ideas anymore. And that's why the second half of the Silver Age dries up completely. They have nothing. They have Captain Marvel, which was just basically taking a name that was, you know, suddenly became available. And what else did they have? They had very little the second half of the Silver Age. They had almost nothing because Lee was on his own. And again, you know, Romita was a tough one for me to write because of the things that he said. And even at the end, when Ditko passed away, they asked him about it, and he seemed almost annoyed that they were asking him about it. Like he was thinking, what do I say? You know, is Marvel going to get mad at me and said, you said too much, or blah, blah, blah. And it really sucks that corporations can have that much of a control over people's lives and force them to think a certain way. And me and Mark Waid are not friends because we had this conversation on Facebook and he blocked me. I take it as a badge of honor, the fact that Mark Waid blocked me because, I wasn't going to. Mark Waid's kind of a bully. I don't know if you've ever talked to that guy, but he's sort of one of these writers that he'll bully people on there. So, I worked for Marvel, just because you worked for Marvel, it doesn't make you any more educated on what's going on as anybody else. Corporations don't tell everybody what they're thinking, They don't say, hey, listen, we want to screw people over and do this and tell all the writers that. They don't tell them that. Hey, listen, we're going to get rid of everybody's insurance packages because we just don't want to pay it, And, but yeah, it's the corporations. Herb Trimpe brought it up. And, the thing that he had to sign, you can't talk bad about Marvel. We can't talk bad about Stan Lee, blah, blah, blah. It sucks because I think it's more interesting to know the truth than it is Marvel's version of the truth. That's the way I see it.
An aspect of your book that I really appreciated because I feel like it is often overlooked is the Doctor Strange of it all, because it's like this important run by Ditko that even at the time, as you mentioned, and I don't think I'd ever realized just how much Stan Lee was burying it at the time. The fact that I knew that Doctor Strange was not really on the covers, but I hadn't realized to what degree he wasn't on the covers. Like, it's really fascinating to see how much he was downplaying this, because I remember seeing in the narration, like, I guess we'll try this thing that Steve wants to do, and then suddenly it becomes a Steve and Stan joint, even though it was someone he actively didn't like. It's fascinating.
Yeah, and I grew to appreciate it even more too. I had read it before, and I had thought, man, this is really great. But again, in the context of doing this stuff, in terms of what was going on in Ant-Man at the time, which was dumb, and what was going on in Iron Man, which was dumb, and what was going on in the Human Torch solo stories, which they were just dumb stories. They were no different. And as an 8-year-old kid or a 12-year-old kid, I can see where somebody might read them and like them or whatever, or even a teenager just as a throwaway entertainment and not think that much about it. But in hindsight, as an adult to look at them, it's a clear difference. And what Ditko was doing, what Kirby and Ditko were doing, because once Kirby took control of Thor, and once he took control of Fantastic Four, he, up to the point where he kind of pulled back, created some of the greatest comics ever made. Lee should not be the one to get the full credit for that, because at the same time, we know he had nothing to do with Ditko's Spider-Man or Doctor Strange when it became two of the greatest comic series ever made. Those runs on Fantastic Four, Thor, Spider-Man, and Doctor Strange, all right there in that same area, when Lee was backing away and saying, look at me, I'm the writer, I'm going to go on to colleges and talk to everybody and come into the office 2 days a week. When he was doing that, these guys were left alone and were creating 4 of the greatest comic runs ever in the history of comic books, ever. And Doctor Strange is one of those that doesn't get enough talk. And Lee tried to bury it. He wouldn't put it on the cover. He would barely mention it. Right there at the end, too, that last, 10 issues or so, he took it off the cover completely. Here and there he would put it on there, but for the most part, it would be a complete Doctor Strange cover, or Nick Fury cover. And this was at a time when Captain America and Iron Man were swapping covers every month. 1 month it'd be Captain America cover, 1 month it'd be Iron Man. And Submariner and Hulk were swapping covers every month. 1 month it'd be Hulk, 1 month it'd be Submariner. But in Strange Tales, it was mainly Nick Fury. It was 90% Nick Fury. And I don't think people realize that. I wanted to bring that to light, that Lee was trying to bury that. He didn't like it.
So I definitely agree that I had not realized that before either. Like, I hadn't really thought about the fact that with the other split books, there was more of a set alternating cover swap. And so you actually calling that out made it much more apparent what was happening. But again, it was one of those things where if you aren't confronted with the context, then it won't become clear. So I really appreciated your book for being able to do that in a way that I never really thought about it all side by side.
And let me say this, too, because Doctor Strange is where I really made this point. Lee, and I don't know if he just, I mean, when you're related to the owner and you can, get away with not working, human nature is to do as little as you can. But what Ditko did with Doctor Strange in particular is he made Lee rise to the occasion. There were still times when Lee's dialogue was, kind of, and I don't want to say goofy, but, he didn't take it as seriously as he should have, but he certainly took it more seriously. When you read that Doctor Strange run, Lee rose to the occasion, and there's no goofy dialogue in there or, Doctor Strange saying, what do you think, you're the Beatles or something, making, pop culture references or whatever. Lee wrote it straight. Lee wrote the dialogue straight from Ditko's notes, and I think it's a perfect example of something that was extremely popular. That's the opposite of what people say made Marvel successful. They say it's Stan's jokey dialogue and the characters. Doctor Strange took itself very seriously. Those stories were serious stories. There was no comic relief in those books, and yet they were extremely popular. And again, it proves Lee could write dialogue, good dialogue. If he did in Fantastic Four sometimes. I mean, Kirby and Ditko gave him the material to write decent dialogue at times, and he didn't always do it. But Doctor Strange, I think, is a pretty good example of when he did, and that's just one of the most enjoyable runs in the history of Marvel to read.
Does it surprise you that, given it was something that he kind of derided, that he was bringing it his A game as it was?
Yeah, I think that ultimately he made the decision, and this may be why he didn't like the book, is because he had to sit there and think more. You know what I mean? Maybe that's why he hated doing it, because I'll tell you, once Ditko was gone, even right before Ditko was gone, he was trying to give that thing away to Roy Thomas and Denny O'Neil, and he was done. At a certain point, he was done with that. But I think he came back for a short time with Maurice Severin. Is that right? I think for a short time, but overall he did not want to do Doctor Strange. Yeah, he did not want to do Doctor Strange. So maybe that was why. But he certainly it's an instance I can look at and say he stepped up on a professional level and gave it the dialogue that it needed, that was necessary for that title. That was not a title that needed Millie the Model dialogue. That was a title that needed serious dialogue, and he came through.
Did you? How much Millie the Model have you read?
How much of the what? Millie the Model?
Yes.
I am actually a huge DiCarlo fan.
Okay.
So I like cartoony artists, and so in actuality, I almost was going to do a book on Millie the Model, but the fact of the matter is, in the DiCarlo years, it repeated so many of those tropes over and over and over again that it just, I thought my brain was going to turn to jello and I was going to become Flaming Carrot or something. It got really bad trying to read those things. But no, there's not enough here to write a book about.
One common misconception, not even misconception, but I guess lie or exaggeration that you've heard Stan Lee talk about over the years, which you definitely go into, is the whole idea that, Spider-Man was going to be new, and what people liked about him was that he was going to be a teenager and there hadn't been a real teenage hero. And then you kind of call out the litany of teenage heroes that had already existed at that point, probably most famous being Superboy, obviously. So it's interesting. That's one of those things. There are a number in the book where there's these things that have been mentioned or said that no one's really latched onto and really tried to disprove. We just kind of let them gloss over us like a wave, and this is definitely one of them. So I did appreciate your kind of being like, look at all these teen heroes, and they were all headliners.
Right. And Superboy was tremendously popular. Superboy was like one of the top 5 biggest selling comic books in the country for years, leading up to Spider-Man. So that was the most obvious one. But, as we've learned, through politics, if you say something over and over and over and over and over again, people start to believe it. And, you still hear Roy Thomas talking about the golf game story as the creation of the Fantastic Four. It's been disproven by 3 different, people who have access to the information and know better at DC Comics. And they all said, no, never happened. Yet they just continue to repeat that lie over and over and over and over again. And probably will for as long as he's alive.
I guess it's one of those things where, like, in terms of Stan Lee, like, the best story he ever wrote was the story of Stan Lee. Because there's been so much mythologizing over time, and you've talked about this in the book and even in the previous interview we had, where it is difficult for people who kind of grew up in this shadow of Stan Lee and kind of seeing his name on all the books and reading the stuff and kind of having this idea, and especially in the later years, the cameo era, right, where from like 2000 to his death, where he was in like every Marvel movie and everyone was like, oh, there's Stan. He was like, where's Waldo in the Marvel Universe? That it can be challenging for people to have to confront that, there is this other side that was always there, but we just weren't aware of it, or like we were young and we learned the mythology of this character, and it's hard for that to be called into question. And some people, and you've talked about this before, come at that more violently and say, like, as if it's taking away or making you look stupid, but you weren't stupid, you didn't know this, now you can learn something new. Do I necessarily feel, and I said this before when reading your first book, I do think that sometimes you're extra harsh about the way in which you say it in your book, but I understand the ideas that you're expressing, and I don't think you're wrong. I think your contextualizing is correct. So it is a very challenging thing. How have you felt people have responded to this book compared to the last book, or is it more of the same? People who are already kind of believe in your kind of, not in your camp, in your perspective, are feeling good about the book, and the people on the other side are the opposite, or has there been any kind of converts?
Yes, there are people that I think I've learned. And you're right about the first book. I mean, there is a little bit of a harshness to it sometimes. I've actually thought about going back and editing that book and taking out some of them, because in writing it, there were times I would get angry because, ultimately it comes down to Steve Ditko and Jack Kirby were 2 of our greatest creative people in the history of comic books, and they really got shafted by Lee. And so it really, really does make me angry. But I've thought about going back and re-editing it and taking out that part of it, because so much of that story, the artists say themselves. I always like to say, isn't it weird that no artist that ever worked with Stan Lee throughout the entire time he was supposedly writing these stories ever said, Stan brought me the greatest story. I couldn't believe how good it was, and I couldn't wait to draw it. Nobody ever said that. None of those artists ever said that. That's astonishing. But when it comes to people and their reaction to it, there are 2 things that I keep in mind. Number 1 is that mainstream audience that sees the cameos and has grown up thinking Stan Lee, that learned it because of that. They're actually different, because they are part of a mindset that celebrities get built up and then they get tore down. So when they eventually hear, well, this is what Stan Lee really did, they're kind of like, oh, really? Tell me about that. Because they want to know. Because they want to feel like they're being educated on it. The Marvel, what I call the Marvel zombies, the Lee apologists, you have to remember something. They're not defending Stan Lee. They're defending their nostalgia. And that's why it's so personal to them. To them, not all of them, but a lot of them were, and I was too. I was a dorky kid. I wasn't a super athlete or super popular, and I had my friends or whatever, but I could be a loner at times, sitting there reading my comic books. It was a world of adventure that was like, oh, wow, this is great. And so Lee spoke to them and made them feel better about their situation or whatever and brought that in. I grew up in the 70s, so I missed that, and thankfully it never blinded me. I was kind of untrusting of it even in the 70s, but so for people, when there's going to be people who don't ever look at it differently, because to them, the memory of their, I call it white knuckling that nostalgia. They're never going to let go of it. But some people that grow up and they think, "Oh, I was a kid then. I read Dr. Seuss at one point. I'm not in love with Dr. Seuss. It's the big deal." And yeah, that's a shame that it happened. So there are always going to be people that hate it because they hate it. And to be quite honest, go for it if that's how you want to live your life. But some people want to know the truth, and some people want to see reality for what it is. And I don't hate Stan Lee. I dislike what he did to those people. I don't know him personally, but I dislike what he did to Kirby and Ditko and those other artists. I see him the same way I would any bullshit artist. I know within what context to view him. That's the way I looked at Stan Lee. And I almost ran into Stan Lee one time. He was coming out of the Hyatt secret breakfast area for, celebrities and stuff like that. Coming out, there was a little thing you come through as I was coming through the thing, and I almost ran headfirst into him. And, but I didn't know him. So I can only judge him by what I know of him. And so what I know of him, that doesn't make me happy what he did. Mm-hmm. And people can view it however they want. I'm just putting the information out there for the ones who want to understand the truth, that are interested in it. Because it is, to me, it's very interesting. Mm-hmm. They can use it, they can use it themselves. So.
Well, it is interesting because I do feel like, one thing you do take pains to do is to try to reduce any editorializing and try to just put it in their own words as much as possible. And so that yes. I do appreciate, because a lot of it is like, well, this is what they said in this interview. This is what's being said just by nature of the art. This is what this other person said. This is all in old interviews and things that you've culled from, different sources. So you don't do a lot of editorializing, or at least you try to minimize it and try to let their own words speak for them.
Yeah. And I especially, in one instance, especially I pointed out when I was talking about Roy Thomas and how, in a sense, based upon two different times he was talking about the same event, in a sense, he perjured himself when he went and did his testimony in the Kirby trial, because there's clearly instances in the past where he said something else that tells us that he did know. And I said, but I'm not saying that. You look at the information that's there and make your own decision, and that's the way it should be. That's the best way to do it. Absolutely. I tried to keep my feelings out of it as much as I could in this book, more so than the first one. And I think it benefits it definitely.
Reading your books and just general things I've known about the industry, it feels like the most mysterious character in Marvel Comics is Martin Goodman, because he's so important to everything, and yet we really don't know that much about the guy. Right.
Absolutely. We know more of what Lee wanted to tell us than we know about Martin Goodman, because you can't really trust Lee in terms of what he's saying as far as who he was. And, he is the mystery man. It would be great. I know... man, just to think, to be able to go back in time and interview some of these people at certain points, it's amazing that no one really ever sat down with him and really interviewed him and seen. Now, I don't know if you, what you thought of the Jason Goodman thing in the book, where I guess a couple of years ago, when Stan, it's been almost 8 years?
Yeah.
Something like that. There was a Comics Journal story on it, And in the comments section, someone calling themselves Jason Goodman in the family line came in there. And he, of course, brought out his own comics later, but had an argument with people in terms of, and said some things, that if it was somebody faking it, they used certain phrases and stuff that you wouldn't think that they would use. There was some things to it to make those of us who analyze stuff like that say, I think this is him. He later denied it and said, no, I have no idea what you're talking about. But, I put that in there and discuss it. And you can see that there are some things that, man, would have been great to be able to interview Martin Goodman and actually speak to him about, because obviously he had his thoughts and beliefs, and obviously felt like Stan screwed him over as well, because he went and created another line of comic books, at probably the worst time you could probably try to do it. But yeah, he is the mystery man without a doubt.
Yeah, it's interesting that, again, in that same kind of family line, you have someone who wants all the headlines, which is Stan, and then you have Martin, who doesn't want any of them.
No, he's wanting to make money. He just wanted to put it out and didn't really care. I mean, he had a certain, obviously, aesthetic that he wanted, but it didn't involve creativity. He didn't understand creativity. Stan didn't understand creativity. And there are things that he does that, if you look at after Kirby leaves, oh man, my next book is on 70s Marvel. And the way those guys screwed the whole company up, they screwed it up. I know there's a lot of beloved writers. One of my favorite artist guys, Jim Starlin, was during that time. And Starlin did good work. Mm-hmm. You could see the passion behind it. The people that followed Kirby and Ditko, the ones who believed Lee was the force behind everything, really were not very successful. And I know we think of him as successful. We think of Steve Englehart as successful, but the best stuff that Englehart did was with Bruner, who says he wrote most of it. Mm. And, Gerber and their artists telling us, no, Gerber never had the scripts. I always had to start without him and, come up with part of the story and stuff. But all of those guys, realistically, the 70s failed. Marvel was going to go bankrupt in 1978. Star Wars saved them. Mm-hmm. Those guys didn't save it. It wasn't until they brought in the guys that followed Kirby and Ditko. Even in the 70s, somebody like Starlin was influenced not by Stan Lee. He was influenced by Kirby and Ditko, and you can see it in the work that he did. And he was when they reprinted stuff from the 70s, they weren't reprinting, the Avengers, Squadron, Supreme. They were reprinting Jim Starlin. When they did the Baxter paper stuff, they were reprinting, Starlin's Captain Marvel, stuff like that. And it wasn't, Marvel didn't really get their shit together until Shooter started bringing in creators. Byrne was a writer-artist. Miller was a writer-artist. These were guys that came in. Simonson was a writer-artist. These guys were influenced by Kirby, Ditko, not by Lee. And that's what, again, the creativity that built it up and made it. It wasn't gimmicks. Of course, they started into the gimmicks, the editorial did, but the thing that built Marvel back up was, once again, creative people coming in and doing good comics,
Absolutely. Obviously a lot of those examples are, you have people who are doing it all. They're writing it and they're drawing it and they're kind of, I think you mentioned in your book, the idea of them being more auteurs. These guys who kind of come in who have the full package ready to go, and it's not a surprise that stuff really hits, because they're also artists and who understand the storytelling and are able to do things in a different way.
Miller made Daredevil his character.
Oh yeah,
and created a new backstory for it, that expanded upon the original and basically recreated the character. Yeah, and there is one, comics is failing because editorial spearheads comics, mainstream comics, and comics are failing because of that. I know people say, "Oh, I did $50 million last year," or whatever, but realistically, individual floppies are not. Even trade paperbacks don't sell for the big two the way they did. It's creator-owned stuff, people who are doing their own thing, and there's there's a great model for it of somewhere in the world where comics are still popular. And the reason they're popular in Japan is because, generally speaking, the creators handle the character throughout its entire life.
Mm-hmm.
Now, once in a while, you get something like Dragon Ball Z had that creator who, at a certain point, I mean, my God, he'd been doing it. Dragon Ball Z. He'd been doing it for 20 years. And finally was like, I'm going to hand this off to another creative team. But he handled the character for 20 years. And when the original creator handles a character for the life of it, it becomes much more of a true story because no one's ever going to understand that character better than the guy that created him and knows his motivation deep inside better than anyone. And so that's why I believe, well, besides the fact that they're more creative, but that's why I believe manga is still successful, because they write great stories, they have great characters, and those original creators stay with it throughout the life of the book. So,
well, it's interesting with the advent of multimedia, the idea that you don't really get new characters so much from the big two, because why would someone give their best stuff away for free?
Absolutely,
so to speak. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's absolutely. And that was Roy Thomas's thing too, even way back in the 70s. He recognized it. He said it in an interview. I don't really like to create characters because I'm not going to own them. So, but now of course he's saying, "Oh, I created Wolverine, by the way."
That's the most egregious one. That's
boy. Yeah, that's a whole nother thing. Somebody said I should write a book about Roy Thomas. I don't know that I could. I once again, I get a little annoyed by it. I don't know if you read Will Byron's Four Color Sinners website, fourcolorsinners.com.
Okay.
Great site. And he, more than anybody, should write a book about Roy Thomas. Oh, boy, he really, and he does the same thing. He brings out the receipts, and shows. And he's got a steadier hand than me when it comes to not getting annoyed by some of these peacock personalities thinking they're more than they are. But yeah, there's some good reading for you. fourcolorsinners.com. Go over there and read his Roy Thomas stuff. You'll be like, wow. Yeah.
So you're working on a book on the 70s. When do you think that might come out?
Actually, I'm hoping to get it done this year. I'm actually I don't know what it was with the Spider-Man book. At a certain point, it became almost like a wet blanket on my shoulders, and I don't know if I was feeling pressure or what it was, but I started to get writer's block at certain times, and I was like, what the hell, man? But I'll tell you what, this book, I have grabbed it, and I'm very motivated with it, and I'm hoping it stays with it. And if it does, I'm hoping to actually have it out this fall, and we'll see what happens with that. Things can fall different ways, but right now I'm making great time on it, so hopefully, a little quicker with this one.
Would you keep going by decade, or have you thought about what would come next, or what other things you want to tackle?
That's a good question, and I think that I would just leave it as we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens with it. I think because I had another book that a friend of mine was trying to get me to write. He was telling me, you should do this. You should do this. And I kept explaining to him, I said, listen, it's not like saying, I think I'm going to, plant 4 trees out in my yard. You just go out there and dig it up and plant your trees. You got to have you got to feel it. You have to feel like, you have to feel it, or else you can't do it justice. Right now, this is what I feel with the 70s book, and I'm having fun with it. It's neat to go back through this stuff, and I think the 70s gets mythologized a lot because those guys who followed Lee were, they were all like within the Marvel method ideology, and you can create your own version of events or whatever. And I'm going to disprove some of that stuff because a lot of that junk from the 70s was horrible. A lot of that stuff was horrible. And I think they had some good ideas. They tried to do some good ideas, but once again, unless you got a writer-artist, it's just not going to be as good. And they ran the good writer-artists out of there. They ran Jim Shooter out of there. They ran Mike Plug out of there. They ran Frank Bruner out of there. They ran the good guys out. They ran Kirby out of there a second time. And I'll tell you a great book to read that sums up the 70s the best for me at Marvel in terms of how it changed. Amazing Adventures #1. You got Jack Kirby, who was finally able to write and draw his own stuff. Now, obviously, he was getting ready to leave for DC and didn't want to do too much. But you can see why Kirby was always successful, because he wrote stuff where the characters, they did things. They didn't explain shit to you. The characters just, the bad guys over there, let's go. And there was always action. There was always movement, and, things happened. And it's easy to read. He wrote a book. He wrote stories for people. You could be 8 years old or you could be 80 years old. You could pick it up and read it. And then the second story was the Black Widow, and it was written by Gary Friedrich, and they had a couple different artists on it. I think Colin ended up on it, but it's a Marvel. He started in the 60s, but he can be lumped in with the next generation of 70s Marvel writers, where they came in and there's protests going on in the streets, and it's about the Puerto Ricans are poor and they're battling the politicians who want to keep them down, and the all of the social things that were going on in the world that they brought into the comics. It wasn't necessarily wrong, but for newsstand comics, which was what comics still were at the time, it was. Because when you look at the numbers, when both Marvel and DC did their polls, 70% of their readers were under the age of 14. They didn't care about that shit. They wanted to read exciting stories, and the numbers in the 70s were pretty bad. So, like I say, there's a lot of it, but that book, Amazing Adventures #1, is the perfect example of the splintering of Marvel and which way it went with the 70s, and Kirby the old way, and the second story in there the new way. And you can call it's subjective, good or bad or whatever, but it didn't sell. The numbers for Marvel went down. They became the #1 publisher, but only because DC imploded even more than they did.
That's true. Yeah, the DC implosion was not far off.
Oh, they were horrible, man. They did that. It was like they just continually shot themselves in the foot, especially with pricing. Just terrible.
How much, in your 70s book, obviously in the first two books that you've done, you've talked about circulation numbers. You haven't really talked that much about, obviously the price of comics and the economics of it. Does that play a part in your 70s book?
Yes, it will, because there's a couple of price changes there, and so it certainly does play a part. And on top of that, the stories didn't help it. The way they did their comics didn't help it on top of it. But especially, Marvel really tried to do, Marvel Tales in those books started out as 64 pages for 25 cents. And, slowly they became normal size because they just didn't sell like that. Even back as far as the Silver Surfer trying to sell that for 25 cents at first. It was like, it's not going to work. And that book was bad enough that even taking it back to 15 cents, it didn't sell with the crap. But it was because it was poorly wrote. They were always trying to, and part of that, there was a reason for that. On the newsstand, as magazines went up in price, they were more profitable to the newsstand dealers. So as comics still at 12, 15 cents, and it's like, they didn't want to make as much room for the comic books because they wanted to make the higher price point off of the magazines, things that went up in price. And as comics tried to go up price on the newsstand, it just shot itself in the foot. It just, it was impossible to get people to pay that because the audience wasn't college kids, even though if it was, college kids historically tend to be broke a lot of times, but it was kids, and kids only had so much money to spend. So, that will play a part, though. That's a good question. It definitely will play more of a part of the book for sure.
Excellent. Well, Chaz, thank you so much for coming back and chatting about this book. And again, I'm looking forward to your next one. And if it does drop this year, I'd love to have you back on to talk about it.
I'd love to be back, man. Love talking this stuff. So, keep up the good work.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
As much as it seems like I might not like comics because of the books I write, I do. I still love the art form, and I I still have very fond memories of comics from that era. So yeah, I still love it. So keep promoting and keeping comics alive. It is an art form worth saving in America.
So that does bring up an interesting kind of perspective. Do you think, like, obviously these two books, I don't want to say that they're negative, but obviously you have, there's a target. It's about let's set the record straight, but it can be perceived as negative. Do you find, like, after the 70s book, do you envision a book that might be more positive about bringing something up as opposed to kind of settling the truth?
Well, certainly an 80s book chronicling Byrne coming in. And I had my good and bad with Byrne, but I mean, the fact of the matter is, looking back, I would take a creator like that any day over. Marvel went through another period where they had that, but let's stay with what we're doing here. So, yes, I see that there's a positive, but unfortunately it ends on a negative because Shooter, as much as he did all the right things to get Marvel back on track, he then did all the wrong things and destroyed it, on the back end of it, which wasn't all his fault, as Marvel became more and more corporate and, answerable to people that had, nothing to do with comics. It just became about money, and that's why I don't understand people's obsession with the companies. Like, oh, I'm a Marvel guy. Oh, I'm a DC. Who cares? They're corporations, and they don't care about you. They only care about extracting as much money from you as they can. Enjoy. I've always, since I was younger, when I was younger, this will give you my mindset. I read a Steve Englehart, Sal Buscema, Captain America comic. I always forget the number on it, but I just thought it was terrible. I was only like 14 years old. I was like, this is stupid. I loved Spider-Man, and I loved, I was pretty well read, or fairly well read, but I loved Jim Starlin's Captain Marvel, too. I thought it was an incredible book, and I remember getting his first Shang-Chi issue and being like, oh my God, So from the beginning, I followed creators because to me, I loved Spider-Man. Spider-Man was my favorite character, but I didn't read it during the Len Wein, Marv Wolfman years. McFarlane I started to pick up again because there was a buzz around it, but I didn't like Mussolini's writing on it, and I ended up leaving it during Larson's run. But nothing against Larson. Larson was a writer-artist who had a lot of creative ideas. I don't know. It just suddenly, I thought, what am I reading? This is nothing like Spider-Man anymore. So I followed creators, and as I still, if I'm going to follow somebody like a Jeff Darrow or somebody like that, I don't care what they do because I like their work and it's going to entertain me. Charles Burns. There's times I don't even analyze Charles Burns. Like sometimes I'm like, I have no idea what this is about, but it hits me on a level that I love, and so I follow it and appreciate it. And so as far as the 80s, I think it is a good story because it starts out great and then it falls apart. But it would be hard to do it in terms of just taking on the positive part of it. Maybe that could be the biggest part of the book, and I don't focus as much on the falling apart, but that's not what people want to read. People like the falling apart.
True.
So, yeah. Maybe I'll find an artist. I'll choose an artist and do a book specifically on them that I can say, this is a great artist, and they don't have any skeletons in their closet, and I'll just do a book on their career and say, maybe I'll pick somebody like Mike Allred, and I'll say, here's a guy that I always enjoyed, so maybe something like that. Yeah.
I love the positivity.
Yeah. And there's positives. I know what you mean. Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I think that it is a good philosophy, and it's a shame that I have to pick on this with the negative side of it because ultimately I'm an extremely positive person. I do a TikTok thing for my living in Thailand here, and that's one of the things that people point out about me is they say, Chuck, you're always so positive. You always take the positive direction. And I think that's funny because in my writing, as far as comics, it does seem like it's a negative thing. But I love Spider-Man. I love Ditko. And I know my contemporaries aren't happy when I say this, but I loved Romita's work. I grew up with Romita's work, and I loved it. So you can probably tell in this book, it was harder for me to be angry. I could still be angry at Lee because he cheated them. But I wasn't as angry as Romita. I did point out when he said things, I was like, oh, my God, But I know where it came from. It came from working for a corporation that's telling you what to think. But so the book is a little more. The book is a little warmer. I think it's definitely warmer than my first book because I do love both Ditko and Romita's work, and it makes it easier for me to.
Yeah, well, I would say that this book is also. You're trying to refute things about Stan, but also to venerate Ditko and Romita to different degrees, which is true. I mean, the other book was much more point of fact, like this is all the different times Stan Lee lied and why and how, whereas this one was much more focused on like the artistry that was going into the books and venerating them. So like as much as there's negativity, you are positive about the creative endeavors by the artists.
Yeah, that's funny because that first book, like you say, every single line of it is basically me refuting what Lee says and then showing the receipts, for it or whatever. It's almost like I should get young Sheldon to be the audio version of that book or something. That's what it feels like sometimes, probably to people. Like, oh my God! But this book is a little warmer. Absolutely, you can tell I do have an affection for a lot of the stories and. Even in the Romita years, I say that here's a great example of why I think Marvel had trouble. I think Ditko and Kirby were both great at finishing stories. Lee with Romita, could come up with good ideas. They just weren't good at finishing them. Like, as an example, the first story they did in Spider-Man was the unmasking of Peter Parker, the unmasking of Green Goblin. What a great idea. The finish of it, he slips on the chemicals and gets an electrochemical blast, whatever the hell that is, and it gives him amnesia. That's kind of a cop-out ending, you know what I mean? And most writers would feel like, they would feel like Jerry Conway did when he wrote, when the Goblin killed Gwen Stacy. The Goblin had to die. And it was a different time. That wouldn't have worked in 1965, 66, but but all through that you could see Lee could come up with ideas that could sell a comic book sometimes. He just couldn't. It was the doing it the correct way to where it made sense and it was interesting and it finished. Kirby and Ditko could finish those stories. Yeah,
that's true. All right, well, Chaz, I'm going to let you get back to your morning, but thank you so much for taking the time, and we'll make sure to have you back on when the next book drops.
It's always fun, man.
Excellent.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. Thank you so much.